Hello. Hi, welcome. I am Cora Fox, and I'm Associate Professor of English and the coordinator of the Health Humanities Initiative at the Institute for Humanities Research. And I'm your host again for this 4-part series of webinars on the histories and cultures of epidemics. So today we're welcoming Rebecca Totaro, who has spent much of her career tracing representations of plague in early modern literature. And I would like to thank her for being willing to share her research with us and to translate that work for a wider public audience. We hope that highlighting this research will allow scholars to begin to take a leadership role in a crisis that has revealed the vital ways in which health depends on culture as much as it does on science and technology. The pandemic has highlighted the injustices and inequities that are built into structures of care in the US and around the globe. And Rebecca's focus on care networks in her current work might help us move forward to building better systems that offer access to care for all. So I'll take a minute here to thank the many behind the scenes staff members who are making all of this work, especially Liz Grumbach, Lauren Whitby, Barbara Dente, and Selena Osuna, and also the Institute for Humanities Research and Ron Brolio for funding these events in the first place. I would also like to thank Ian Moulton, who is serving as co-host for this event. Ian is Professor of English and Cultural History at Arizona State University's College of Integrative Sciences and Arts. A cultural historian and literary scholar whose research focuses on representations of gender and sexuality in early modern literature. He is the author or editor of many books and volumes, including Love in Print in the 16th Century, the Popularization of Romance, and Before Pornography, Erotic Writing in Early Modern England. I will turn it over in just a moment to Ian to introduce our guest. But first, I wanted to give a quick overview of what to expect for this webinar. First, Professor Totaro will offer a short presentation on her research, followed by a Q&A discussion with Professor Moulton. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, we will open it up for questions or comments from those who are present. We've disabled the chat feature in Zoom, so instead, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit any questions that arise over the course of the presentation or the discussion, and I'll do my best to curate them and address them to Professor Totaro at the end of our session, our webinar today. Okay, so thank you for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Professor Moulton.
Hi, it's my great pleasure today to introduce Rebecca Totaro. She is Professor of English at Florida Gulf Coast University, where she also serves as Associate Dean for Curriculum and Assessment in the College of Arts and Sciences, and that sounds like a lot of work. Professor Tataro is a graduate of Yale and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And as Cora suggested, she has written a lot of books and other studies of the plague in early modern Europe, including the Plague Epic in early modern England, that was from Routledge in 2012, an edited collection representing the plague in early modern England, also from Routledge, 2011. The Plague in Print, Essential Elizabethan Sources from 1558 to 1603 from Duquesne University Press, and Suffering in Paradise, the Bubonic Plague in English Literature from Moulton. So she is clearly someone who has done a lot of thinking about plague, pandemic, and the sort of historical way this plays itself out in early modern England. Her more recent work has moved to earthquakes. Routledge 2018, she published Meteorology and Physiology in Early Modern Culture, Earthquakes, Human Identity and Textual Representation. And her most recent publication is an article, book chapter, embedded in Shakespeare's Fair Verona that appears in the collection Contagion and the Shakespearean Stage from Palgrave in 2019. Professor Tataro has been invited in the past to speak about Plaguetime London at both the Globe Theatre in London and the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., and we're very lucky to have her with us today to talk about lessons from Plaguetime London. So welcome, Professor Tataro.
that if I do write more on this subject of plague in Shakespeare's London, I'm going to owe it to this opportunity to speak to you, to reframe it in a way that is clearly relevant. Study of pandemic history is always meaningful and provocative and disturbing and moving and humbling. But of course, it's taken this for it to become so deeply relevant, practical, and in some specific ways that I'm going to share with you, based on building from the conversation. If you participated last time on Monday, I believe, building on work that was shared by Priscilla Wald about outbreak narratives. So I'm going to share my screen and start in on the PowerPoint that I presented, and it is framed by Priscilla's talk about outbreak narratives. And what she shared with us is the fact that the outbreak narrative that has been dominant in Western culture since the 1980s and beyond Western culture, thanks to the movies, is one that demonizes microbes and makes them from some other place as if they're a cruel invading alien. And we absolutely need to replace those narratives to prevent us from blaming the wrong sources for our suffering. We as humans are very good at doing that. And in thinking about what I could bring to the table with Lessons from Plaguetime London, it's shocking to me the degree to which it's, and I'll say it's imperative that we take another look at pre-scientific responses to pandemics. We have thrown the baby out with the bathwater when we've said to ourselves, aren't we so smart? We know about microbes, and we know about bacteria and antibacterials, and we know about vaccines, and they didn't, so what could we learn from them? And this presentation is going to show you a heck of a lot is the answer, and why historians, literary scholars, people who study cultures in pre-scientific time periods, but also pre-scientific cultures, there are still pockets of populations that deal with pandemic disease differently than we do now. Let's learn from the past and from those other people how to take care of each other better. One of the things that this plague, COVID-19, has shown us is that we're not doing a good job on the taking care of each other part. We're squabbling and getting lost in the weeds. So let's see what you think. Some lessons from Plaguetime London. And I'm going to start with a bit of a history lesson, provided that my, there we go. And so Plaguetime London, I am talking about more contemporary with Shakespeare's time after the Black Death. But this first set of dates of crisis mortality in London associated with these reigns of Henry VII and Henry VIII are the first years that bubonic plague is coming back in England after it had subsided in the 14th century Black Death pandemic. We are still in Catholic London at this time, or Catholic England, the Catholic world. So people look to the Pope, and they look to the tried and true outbreak narratives, if we want to call them that. And so, and I'll pause here to say, outbreak narratives have corresponding outbreak comforts, the stories we tell to comfort ourselves that are a response to the narrative we're telling ourselves. So in the Catholic world at the time, if you're telling yourself a certain kind of story about how the plague develops, whoops, that went by too fast. You're telling yourself that it's because of sin. And the comfort that the church provides is to say, pray, and pray to the saints who will save you from plague. And there are specific ones. You see Saint Roch on the right. He's pointing under his tunic to a plague bubo, actually. And Saint Sebastian on the left, who's full of what they called plague arrows, as if the pestilent arrows had been coming straight from God into his body. So the outbreak narrative would be one of plague coming from yourself, your sin, and the comfort would be pray to these saints and hope they'll help you out. Go on a pilgrimage, maybe that will also get you some points so that you can avoid hell and then get out of purgatory sooner. Things change quite quickly, and that's why I've got the dates back here again. 1535 is another outbreak of bubonic plague such that London is rather leveled. Things come to a rather screeching halt. The king has to leave and make sure that flee from London and make sure that he's nowhere that plague is reigning. They obviously don't know that what causes it. So basically to get out from where it appears to be clustering is the only solution. 1535 is that date, but 1534 is when King Henry separates from the Catholic Church and declares himself the head of the church and state in England. So what to do with the immediately outdated outbreak narrative and the immediately outdated outbreak comfort, as well as the ways you care for each other, because the Catholic Church had also been the only system of care that was somewhat unified, where people could go and get some relief, have a bed, get taken care of by monks or nuns. When that goes away, England's in rather some tough shape. As you know, they sell off or give to, Henry gives to his friends convents and monasteries. So they're kind of in a place where, they were kind of in a place where we are now, which is needing some radical change or having some radical change to healthcare as they had known it. I'm going to show you all of the other years. It's astounding. In case you think COVID-19 is bad, and it is, I'm not saying it's not, but look at how many years there was crisis mortality in England related to bubonic plague. By the way, bubonic plague mortality rate is 50 to 70%, and it's called bubonic plague. Most of you know this because you get swellings about egg size in places of lymph nodes, including the groin. And it was called Black Death because there's gangrene associated with it, which turns all of your extremities black. So look at how many dates those are. This is a heck of a long time then for you to refine your outbreak narrative. And this is why I'm saying, let's learn from this time period. They had time to say to themselves, hey, we want to tell ourselves some good stories, some helpful stories, so that we can either prevent this, and not knowing how to prevent it, at least care for each other better. So that's the thrust here. Of course, they didn't have science. They did have ways to care for each other and ways of spent more time thinking about that as their frontline defense than we do. So when this change to Protestantism comes about, it's associated, as many of you know, with the rise in study of the humanities and also in the boom of the printing press that puts out more and more cheaper and cheaper pamphlets that more and more people can buy. And so we have, under Elizabeth, the first, what we could call as plague as a genre with subgenres. So the new outbreak narrative becomes the whole nation is infected. It can't be individual sin, but all of us are impacted and we need to protect all of us. And the old ways we can't turn to because they're Catholic old ways, but also they weren't working. And so they weren't so self-aware to say, that's broken, let's throw it out. But what they did have to do is replace their means of comfort. And the way they distributed that thinking was not through paintings, was not in church always, but it was partially there. But it was through printed materials. So I'm going to show you a couple of those. Whoops, I don't want to end anything. So early on, it did start out as a church effort under Queen Elizabeth. So you can see the dates from 1563, and then with every outbreak of plague thereafter up until the early 1700s, the church issued the equivalent of this form to be used in common prayer twice a week, and also an order of public fast to be used every Wednesday in the week during this time of mortality and other afflictions wherewith this realm at this present is visited. So what's super interesting is that the church took the position that we like Elizabeth. God likes Queen Elizabeth. God doesn't think England is sinning because that's what the Catholics would want to say. What these documents, what these prayers push is the idea that God is being a good father to us. He could have made the bubonic plague, made the plague even worse. So we need to come together and collectively just do a little better. So we're going to pray more, And we're not always going to be in church. You can use this form of common prayer in your home. And there were prayers that you could memorize and do at home so that they recognized they didn't want crowded areas. So it's super interesting. The message was not shame on you, you started it, whatever it was. Let's come together in prayer. Throughout the whole nation, this was used. Now, we, again, with hindsight, most of these documents and most of these prescriptions, we're going to want to say, well, we're not groupthink people. We don't have one church. We can't do it like that. And that's true. But we can learn about things like consistent messaging and how many lives were likely saved by the consistent messaging coming out of Elizabeth's government at this time on plague that included the messaging coming out of the church, as opposed to what we have now. It's pretty impressive, the difference that we can learn from it. So among the readings that they prescribed was the book of Jonah. And it's not because God saved Jonah from the belly of the whale. It's rather instead because when Jonah's mission, the one that he's trying to avoid when he gets put in the belly of the whale, is to go tell Nineveh. So he goes into the city and he cries. He's supposed to tell them God's mad with them. And so the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast. Nineveh shall be overthrown. So when he goes to tell the people of Nineveh, it's this entire population, that they're going to be overthrown, the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast, which is what England is doing, right? And put on sackcloth, and from the greatest even to the least of them did this. So again, collective behavior. I know we don't like that, but it was helping. And even the king. So, for word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from him, and he covered himself in sackcloth, imagine that, and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh by degree of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn every one from his evil way and from the violence that is in their hands. Who can tell if God will turn and repent and turn away from his fierce anger that we perish not? So they're hopeful. But God does relent. So this is the story. Let's all come together and make it better. Every one of us. In this case, it's cute that even the animals join them. But, why not? About 10 years later, 15 years later, the Elizabethan government followed with quarantine orders for the entire country. And they're called orders thought meet by Her Majesty, and it goes on. And these orders, like the prayers, were issued every time there was a plague outbreak from 1578 to the early 1700s. And they do lay out rules about what kind of conditions will keep you in your home, when someone might need to come in and check that you have plague, and how to keep people fed if they're locked in their homes, and how to take care of people under those conditions. So again, it sounds like, okay, national quarantine orders, this is pretty heavy-handed, it takes away my liberties. But within these orders and within the consistent messaging coming out of the Elizabethan government, you're going to hear some flexibility. So I just wanted to share this with you in again, a reason to reread and rethink pre-scientific approaches to pandemics. So this is the first order. First, they shall inquire and presently inform themselves by all good means, and this is the justices for each town, which towns and villages are at the time of such assembly infected. So the justices of a region would have these towns and villages. They want to see which ones have real problems, and in what hundred and other division the said towns and villages are, and how many of the same places so infected are corporate towns, market towns, villages. You see, it's a careful, precise accounting. And they shall consider the wealth of the inhabitants of the same towns and parishes if they're able to relieve the poor that are or shall be infected and to be restrained in their houses. So if you're going to require everyone equally, because everyone equally was susceptible to this, to stay in their homes, some people will be able to earn money and some people won't. And so how do you care for everyone? We really didn't figure, we had hundreds of years between this time and our current time, and we are scrambling to figure out how to care for those people who can't do their work, do their jobs, who need to be staying home quarantined or with family members who have underlying conditions. And I'll just read part of this one, that this gives justices flexibility. The said justices may put in execution any other orders that by them at their general assembly shall be devised and thought meet, tending to the preservation of her majesty's subjects from the infection. And to the end their care and diligence may the better appear, they shall certify in writing the said orders newly devised. And then it talks about punishments for those who break those orders. We don't like punishments. We don't like to be told what to do. We don't like this idea of someone making up new orders. And yet what I'm saying here is there's a executive action from Elizabeth, and yet it has flexibility built within it so that on the ground, these justices, who are people who are elected by the people of each of these in these areas, they have flexibility and some authority to make decisions that are local. Another subgenre of plague writing that appeared at the time and that continued 1578 to 1666 is accounting of the dead. This comes closer to what we recognize as how we deal with pandemics. This counting of the dead, what it did was for every parish, it assigned a number, it numbered the plague dead for each parish. This is a first step toward population studies. It is a first step toward counting people rather than experiencing them as full human beings, toward demographics, toward things that we now are struggling to get out from under because we've overused number. We're treating people in ways that as if they don't matter because, well, it's just a certain population of that's affected. I want to show you something behind the scenes of this. So Rochelle Munkoff is one of the scholars, actually few scholars, who's doing the labor-intensive work to read the parish records to show us what's behind the numbers of dead. How did they figure out who died from plague? Might they not have died from something else? And it's because there were women who were assigned by their parishes, by the church, to go in and inspect the bodies of the dead to determine if it was plague or something else that caused the death. It's astounding. So there was called before the parish these persons hereafter following that have weekly pension out of the parish for their relief, and it gives a long list of names. 2 of those people were chosen. And they were sworn an oath at the very end. They take an oath before the deputy concerning that charge so that they are truthful in it, because as you can imagine, people might want to bribe them. I'm sharing this with you to show you the lived experience behind the plague number. We need more of that lived experience. That's why we need video cameras on crime scenes, or on potential, or on we need more eyes. We need more information. We need to remember the lived experience behind the data point before we take action. And so it's interesting that we do have these records as well. And I will add, so here's another way to read this information. So we might think these women are being forced to be searchers. It's not a great job, to be sure. But the information we get here is that they are receiving a pension already from the church. So these are likely widows, if you were to read the detail here. They can be widows. They might be women who had children out of wedlock and the church was supporting them. They are already on the church's payroll. So in a way, this is an interesting opportunity to give these women work and more or less say that they're getting paid for it. I'm going to make a connection later on to some advice I think we could follow from this, but I'll wait on that. So among the many lessons also to be learned from the time are reminders, new ways to read old texts, like you have heard John Donne's No Man is an Island. You're familiar with that concept. You may not know that it's from a larger text called Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. And this is also, from 1624. It was not a plague year. It was the year before a plague year, sandwiched in between them. But John Donne, who was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, and as you know, he wrote some racy poetry in his early time, you might know that. He has caught a disease. He does catch a disease that he fears is quarantine worthy, is contagious. So he quarantines himself, and these meditations, devotions upon emergent occasions, come out from that isolation that he undertakes for himself. And so in isolation, I'll just read the first section and the last. Perchance, so he's in isolation and he thinks to himself, perchance he for whom this bell tolls may be so ill as that he knows not it tolls for him. And perchance I may think myself so much better than I am, as that they who see my state may have caused it to toll for me, and I know not. No man is an island entire unto itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee, and me, and you, and everyone. And we might say, well, it says every man, and shouldn't it say every woman? But my goodness, we need this message right now. None of us are an island, especially in a pandemic. You know? So I'm going to share with you, this is the last passage, and then I'll tie things up. This is from a work I'm going to suggest none of you has ever heard of before, Meditations in My Confinement, but it might be called Meditations While I Am Stuck at Home because I can't leave because I've got COVID-19 or I'm careful about it, or it was March when we were all told to hunker down, basically. Meditations in My Confinement is written by a man named Thomas Clark. We know nothing about him other than the poem that he wrote, and in it he tells us that he self-quarantined. A searcher didn't tell him he had to. No one knew that anybody died of plague in his home, but they did. He lost children due to that, during that outbreak. He also could not have known, by the way, that 1666 was the last plague year in London, and that the fire of London was going to eliminate the thatched roofed housing that is rat habitat. So he didn't know this was the last year of plague. And I want you to see what he focuses on. Now, there are times when he's also concerned about the city. But here's what he is thankful for. For my own part, I must here confess much privilege I had in my distress. I was not padlocked in, nor by a guard of watchmen constraint of freedom barred, but wholly left unto my own discretion, which kindness shows in me too much impression. This, I acknowledge, was my neighbor's love. So imagine he has self-quarantined and he's dependent on his neighbors to help bring him food and not to tell the authorities so that he doesn't have a padlock, so that he is left more free. This is a trust of your community, a trust of neighbors and of each other. It's astounding that it's 1666 and we need this message now. So to that end, I have some lessons from Plaguetime London that are lessons by which we can reframe our outbreak narrative and our outbreak comforts. And the first is going to be to review pre-scientific responses to pandemics. And I suppose you could say all pre-scientific responses to pandemics are cultural because they couldn't be scientific. But let's take a look at them. Let's not throw them out just because they didn't know about bacteria. There's so much we can learn, and they already lived it and they already practiced it over decades and centuries. Next, I'm repeating what I showed you with plague orders and plague prayers and other things coming out of Elizabeth's government. My goodness, let's rely on the same playbook. And we need the world to do it. all people are equally responsible and afflicted. They saw that in early modern England all those years ago. We're all equally responsible and afflicted. Some liberties will be curtailed for everyone, and sharing of resources makes sense. It's essential. That includes medical, that includes it's time to rethink healthcare. We all suffer. Social, all of it. Something much more specific and targeted that's a lesson from plague time is let's create, train for, and fill temporary plague-related jobs. We missed that opportunity. Where are our contact tracers? Nationwide contact tracers who could be paid by the federal government to do this essential work. We dropped the ball on an opportunity to get people paychecks so that it doesn't become locked in some political thing about, oh, people are going to make more money just lazing around. This is one of the just many, many lessons we can learn that are very specific, very practical from the past. And the last one that I'll leave you with is respect for and treasure our connectedness. And so I'll leave you with that, but I will say we need to take action now and be patient, because the process will have to be slow, precise, and long-standing for it to take hold and stick. Real change in society takes decades. So the inquiry, the coming together like this seminar is bringing us together now, this is where we have to start and continue it from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was just wonderful. And there are so many things I'm sort of thinking to ask questions about. I think I've kind of figured that I have sort of two categories of questions. First, sort of questions about the content of your talk and sort of the lessons that we can learn and just things that I'm curious about and that some of our other listeners might be curious about. And then after talking about that for a little bit, I'll move into another series of questions. And these are the ones that Cora shared with you before about sort of what kind of connections can we do as humanities scholars? What's our sort of larger role here, just from your perspective as someone who's worked in this area? One of the things I was wondering about, and you kind of talked about this towards the end with the notion that everyone is afflicted and things like that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how status differences functioned in the early modern period, because I know for people who could afford to, and you mentioned this with Henry, you know, a plague, time to move to my country palace. But then there are lots of people who can't leave London, and I believe in some cases are not allowed to leave London. They shut the city at a certain point. I don't know if that happened in London or not, but I know that it did happen in various places. So I just wondered if you could talk about how those sort of status differences play out, because we're certainly seeing this now where there are people who are, you know, have resources that allow them to have a more comfortable life under pandemic than others.
Thanks. And that's an important question and an incisive one. And you're absolutely right that people like Henry and others who had great wealth could flee London. Why I say that it impacted everyone and they were all in it together and they did a better job of taking care of each other and with charity than I think we're doing, honestly, is because we have no freaking excuse. I'm going to say it like this. We have no excuse for our behavior. They were pre-scientific and they didn't know what was causing it. So Henry could flee, but there was no guarantee he still wouldn't catch it. And he didn't have better health care. So he couldn't know what was causing it. So when, for example, when Queen Elizabeth contracted smallpox, her doctors weren't any better able to help her than a doctor would have been able, or a housewife, to help their own kids. So there was a leveling effect. And so, I mean, there are a whole bunch of fun facts around, you know, Henry VIII would send Sir Thomas More, we know him as St. Thomas More after Henry killed him, ahead of him through the country to see where plague was, to find a safe route for Henry to travel so that he could escape, so he wouldn't encounter plague. So he had to have people to go out, scout it out first. But there was systemic class, horrible inequities and problems. And those, but again, because of the pre-scientific era, strangely, it almost didn't matter when it came to the pandemic. It did, and people felt more under threat if they were stuck in London.
Yeah,
So
and I
I
mean,
missed part of the question.
sometimes too, you get a discourse from the period which is sort of satiric but sort of serious too, that doctors will kill you. That the attention of a doctor is actually because they're not doing things that are necessarily make medical sense, as opposed to, you know, traditional sense, bleeding people who are sick and things like that. Yeah, so that's a really good point, that having better healthcare didn't necessarily mean you were any bit safer. I think that's interesting.
Exactly.
Another thing I was thinking about, we've seen, certainly in the United States, but I think we've seen it in other countries too, that there's an unwillingness of the government to want to take responsibility. In other words, it's sort of like, well, there's nothing we can do really as your government. This is just a thing that's happening, and we don't really, I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me in your talk is when Henry becomes head of the church, that looks like a good political move, but then all of a sudden that makes him responsible, right? For the, you know, following that older Catholic narrative that it's the sinful country. Well, if he's the one who, so I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, how the governments in the time, whether it's Henry or Elizabeth, how they approach the question of taking responsibility for public health in the time of plague.
Yeah, that's a great
As
question.
opposed to being blamed for it, like, well, it's all the fault of the evil king.
Yeah. Well, and Elizabeth, that's why. So I think Henry, I think my speculation is that because the printing press wasn't as able to disseminate as much, and print wasn't as cheap, that there wasn't as much of a public in print discussion that we have access to for me to answer that question about Henry and how he was perceived. But I would assume that Catholics in the country, after he left the Catholic Church, would have thought plague outbreaks were associated with that. Now, plague was already breaking out in the country prior to Henry making the switch. And so what we have is a kind of a combination when Henry and then Elizabeth are wanting to manage this conversation. There are two things. One is Elizabeth didn't have an heir, and her council was really concerned that if she died, there wasn't anybody to replace her. So they had to protect her. And she had already had this round with smallpox where apparently she named Dudley as her successor, and they were horrified. So they wanted to make sure they had something in place that could protect her from plague. But if you don't know how to protect her, if moving her around the country isn't enough, you better make sure everybody around in the whole country has some system. So I think they went from move the king, it's almost like chess. Instead of move the king, they went to move all the other pieces, or actually keep all the pieces in place. And what's a crying shame, what I really like about your question too, is the contemporary relevance of it. It's a freaking, I mean, this is like me, like, it's a crying shame that because our elite people don't have skin in the game, some of them are saying, I don't need to wear a mask. Well, no, you don't need to wear a mask because we have science and we know what's causing it. And you can avoid it for the by and large, and you can get the rapid test 3 times a day. But the frontline workers can't do that. But in the past, Elizabeth and Henry did have skin in the game. So there's something to that. And I wouldn't wish that this were a worse disease that we knew less about, so that all of our officials had skin in the game. But it would be we'd be getting different messaging out of the government, that's for sure.
Yeah. The other thing that people have been very concerned about, and has certainly been a political issue in the United States, but I think it's happening all over the world in different ways, is the question of the economy. I mean, I had done some work on, you know, outbreaks of disease and things like that, because I also study the early modern period like you do. And it had never occurred to me before that in these earlier periods, you don't get the same, you know, sort of panic stress that we have about, oh my God, nobody's going to be able to go shopping for 6 months. That's going to destroy everything. And, you know, some of this may be hysteria, but some of it is also the economic structures that we built for ourselves. in Newton's time, closing the university for plague just meant Newton could go off and figure out like the laws of physics while he was on vacation. Whereas we're dealing right now with the fact that if major universities close down totally, they'll run out of money and may not be able to reopen, and we'll have to fire lots of people. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the sort of economic differences with a sort of pre-modern economy, how it was easier or what challenges they faced just having to stop doing things for a while.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, the question is, and please, people who are listening, be inspired to write about this, do the research and answer these questions because they are so important. And so among the things that's striking when I teach literature of the plague or literature and culture from these pre-scientific times is that people lived experience was, I'm just going to say, richer. People knew their bodies, they knew their backyards, they knew what grew in their backyards, they knew how to make remedies, they knew how to make food, they could survive on what was around them. They didn't need a chain of supply where each isolated piece didn't really communicate with the other, and so one piece breaks down and the whole line breaks down. Just like the fact that they were integrated with their neighbors. So really they're much of the way of life and the things that mattered weren't as harshly impacted. What else are you thinking about with that question?
It interests me as a sort of cultural historian, sort of what are the things that you know, very often the advances you have that make it possible for you to do all sorts of cool things, they're the things that are most fragile. It's like when the aqueducts break after the fall of the Western Empire, when Rome falls in the 5th century. Daily life wasn't necessarily that bad, but all of a sudden the aqueduct doesn't work anymore, which means you can't live in Rome anymore. There's no water. You can only live in places where there's natural water. When the technology doesn't function, all of a sudden a city of 2 million people, it just doesn't work anymore, and Rome depopulates incredibly quickly. It's not necessarily that anything particularly bad is happening on a given day in Rome. It's just there's no one to fix the aqueduct anymore.
Right.
And so now you can't, it all becomes you know, untenable. And I think we're living in a kind of hyper version of that where we have tons of aqueducts we don't even know about, or we don't even know who would fix them and or what would cause them to break down. You know, I don't think anyone predicted that our main concern for a month or so would be toilet paper. You know, I mean, it's like, I don't think that would have been anyone's prediction.
Yeah, and it really shouldn't be. There are a whole bunch of other things you can use. I mean, come on. but you know what? I mean, so you're exactly right. We have lost our way in terms of what matters, and all the little extras that we've built on as if they're essentials. I mean, universities, I hesitate to mention this because I love mine and I understand how they work, but so much of the money comes from student housing and the cafeterias and the associated amenities with student housing that need to be maintained, that are part of that financial structure that goes down if students aren't on campus in classes versus, right, you just don't have the classes and people do something else. No, that's exactly right. And the best metaphor perhaps is a house of cards. We've created a house of cards. So the house of cards is falling and we get to rebuild now.
Yeah.
Hi there, I'm jumping in.
Okay.
Hi, Cora.
Hi, we have some questions already in the Q&A, so I thought I would offer them up and open up our discussion a little bit to those who are in attendance. So our first question was about the terminology of talking about it as pre-scientific, right? Doesn't this depend upon a notion of science, a very particular notion of science? So maybe if you could.
That's right. No, that's a terrible shorthand. And I don't recommend it. That was just a cheap move to save time. Because I mean, you know, because there were I do think they were better observers of nature and better observers of their own body and their own health and other things than we are. And so that kind of knowledge of how to care for yourself, we should put up side by side with what we call science. You Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good question. Somebody's smart out.
No, I think that makes sense. That was one of our attendees asked the question very specifically. He said, you know, isn't science as old as humankind if you define it in certain ways?
Yeah.
He or she suggested it would appear every species, you know, we're observant, right? And that's science. Maybe talking about it as pre-modern science, you know, modern medical or I don't know. Anyway, we could fudge that.
It kind of makes exactly the point, which is I do think most people believe that pre-modern times were pre-scientific times, and so we don't need to pay attention to them. We can't learn anything from them when it comes to a pandemic.
Yeah.
Any more than we could learn from the humanities in a pandemic. Why do we need the humanities? And and we're saying, obviously, we need both.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. We also have another great question that is about consistent messaging, right? Which is one of the things that you're suggesting we could learn. And the question is, what do you do in 2020 when consistent messaging might be false? When it might be false information that is being consistently messaged from authorities in various locations?
Well, this is why we can't move forward. That's where we are. And I don't mean because it is false. I mean because we're even asking that question. Because I think that it's important, at some point there is something about, let's all band together and agree that we've got as much information as we can and do the best we can with this set of information so that at least we're all on the same page and taking some of the same steps, and then we can revise it as it goes forward. So I would hope we'd be more sophisticated than that, but unfortunately the question shows that's where we are is, oh my goodness, we need help.
The other question was, of course, did this take place at the time? Was the messaging sometimes false? And
well, so that's the lovely.
Liz, do you want to jump in too?
Oh, go ahead.
Or no? Oh, I see. Okay, she might be leaving it up to me to. But yeah, so did that happen at the time? Was false messaging happening?
Yeah, that's the lovely piece about let's go back in the past and let there be this refreshing opportunity to say, what if all of it was false? They didn't even know what was causing the disease. So on some level, it was all false, except to stay away from each other. But so they still got on the same message, which meant that they weren't squabbling. They weren't squabbling about how to behave and where to go. And people trusted, for example, the plague bills. So generally, there was not distrust about things like the plague bills that were reporting the numbers of parish dead. Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, there wasn't any squabbling about that. People relied on that as a way to decide whether they're going to go somewhere or not, travel.
Was that because it was locally organized? Was that the system you were talking about where justices of the peace were elected and they chose community members that people would have all known from church and village life and so on?
So that's another huge advantage. We just don't even know our neighbors. So I think, so Priscilla was talking about zombie apocalypse narratives and, zombie narratives. And they didn't have zombie narratives back then because they knew their neighbors, and everybody is like the matchmaker. She knows the generations of families that lived on the same street going back and back. They're not going to turn into zombies and want our food and our weapons. Mm-hmm. So they could take care of each other, like Thomas Clark saying, thank goodness for my neighbors.
Right. So we have another great question. One of our attendees has pointed out that right now there seems to be a conflict in society between kind of, she used the term pre-scientific, but we might say faith-based belief systems, who are saying this might be a hoax, it's fake, there are quack treatments, or the idea that God will protect us is another strain, a different strain of that. And then there's science, right, which has been, the scientific narrative has sort of often been in conflict with some of these narratives. And so she's asking, how do we bridge the gap between those conflicting narratives at the moment? And is there anything equivalent in the period that we're looking at?
Yeah, the first question is the harder question of how we do it now. Just like, can we trust the facts? That kind of question just makes it so impossible to think about how to move forward, except to say other societies and other people have allowed for a more comfortable fit between discourses, and definitely looking at Elizabethan England, and I'm not trying to make this the place that everybody should go look just because I'm studying it. It just so happens that the same year, so 1563, Elizabeth offers nationwide prayers.
Yeah.
And in 1578, there are quarantine orders, which would fly in the face. It would suggest if you pray to God, shouldn't he save you? Why would you need quarantine orders? But the government and the people understood, no, you run them side by side. You pray and you quarantine. And both, you need to go to church and, so they did run side by side, and there was some debate about, well, why do we need to flee if God's protecting us? But those were marginal, not mainstream debates.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, the argument you're making, that I agree that we need to think about, we sort of need to think about what it means in a secular, largely secular society to have that same ethic of care for others, right? That you see coming out of, say, religious writings like devotions upon emergent occasions, right? That imagery is, even though it comes out of religious writings, is actually secular imagery, the idea of an island, right? So I think or it can be secularized anyway. So I think it's a really interesting.
Yeah, and shouldn't we be, if we're so smart, so advanced, and we know so much, why don't we take advantage of all the different places where there's knowledge that will help us, where we can go forward together better? Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is great. We have one more, or so far. And Young O asks if it is thinking about this question of messaging. Was there a blame game going on in terms of foreigners spreading the plague, or someone else taking advantage of the plague? Were people profiting from the plague? Considering this, and he says he'd be really interested to hear if there were similar kinds of stories coming out of the time period.
Well, so I'm gonna I'm echoing for some reason. I'm not sure why. Can you hear that on my end, on your end? Anyway, okay, good. So I'm gonna start with the second piece about so the blame game happened in London, but they were blaming the right people. So they were blaming, there were quacks, that's what they call it, the mountebanks, the people who would set up their stall and say, this is the potion that'll cure the plague. Now we know, of course, nothing cured the plague, so it was all a lie. And they were all phony, but people did catch on that there were scams and schemes. But those were internal. It wasn't vagabond, it wasn't necessarily travelers. And if it was English travelers. It wasn't necessarily people, it wasn't people from the continent. The blame game did not extend beyond the realm, beyond England. I would expect, I expected to see, and I kind of would like to see, because it would fit, that England was blaming Spain. It's the Spanish plague. They don't say that. Mm-hmm. They say it's our plague. God is smiting us. We can do better. It's because he's a good father to us. He smited the Israelites. Let's take ownership from that, just like Nineveh. We better. And so I guess that's where, Cora, to your point, biblical sermons are sermons, and they're religious. They don't have to, it doesn't have to be that all of what they contain, we keep in that hermetically sealed realm of faith. We can apply some of those messages to ourselves, like, why don't we get on board together and take some ownership for the fact that humans, all of us, are pushing into areas of the world that were animal habitat, and we are depleting the animal habitat. So it was animal habitat. We are depleting the animals that are the habitat for the viruses. If we're killing those animals, they're going to jump to us. Let's take ownership for that. Learning from the past where they were taking ownership for the plague. So when there was a blame game about the mountebanks and the quacks, they were blaming them for taking money. They weren't saying they were spreading plague. It's really interesting.
It's fascinating. Okay. I think we might have, Ian, do you want to jump in with, we could offer one of the sort of, what do humanists do kinds of larger questions. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The other kind of question that I was thinking we would want to address is sort of just what are your thoughts, Rebecca, on what kinds of, we've talked about how the humanities can contribute, what kinds of collaborations and what kinds of research that the humanities provides, what are the areas we need most, and what do we do moving forward into a kind of, what we hope is a post-pandemic world? I mean, one of the things that struck me about, I love that you had all the lists of all the years. And I've actually been doing similar work in other areas of Europe. And yeah, this wasn't something that went away. Like, it went away for a couple of years and then it came back again. And so it was a sort of constant living in that world. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about how the humanities can respond to this crisis, and also how we go forward in a world where there may well be other pandemics in the next 5-10 years.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's why I'm saying humanities scholars have to be at the table to talk about how people in the past and in other areas have handled pandemic disease. More particularly, we've been talking about, so at our university we have, of course, a new focus on critical race studies, and absolutely that's essential. And I'm thinking, what about critical healthcare studies? I'm not saying they're separate. They're actually entirely entwined, but let's talk about critical healthcare studies. And let's talk about critical education studies, and maybe some other things that we want to look at because it's all linked. And it occurs to me that when it comes to education, the only people who, like me, I'm an associate dean in curriculum and assessment, right? So I'm taking a critical look at how we're assessing our programs and not our programs. Well, I'm biased, aren't I? I'm not, but aren't I? By being paid by the university. So maybe universities do want to take on, that's why I'm saying, critical healthcare studies, critical education studies. Otherwise, again, it's the administrators of the K-12 or the administrators of hospitals who are already in the system, not able to look critically at their structures. And we can't just leave it to the citizens of our counties, the moms and dads who are trying to figure out what's going to happen with their kids and their parents. I think universities have a leading role to start to form some of these groups, to take this critical look at these clusters, and it'll have to be interdisciplinary. And maybe the humanities people who aren't being asked to speak on virology and who aren't being asked to make hand sanitizer like our scientists are, this is our calling.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is an excellent place for us to end. Here. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Tataro, Professor Moulton. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you for joining us here for this webinar, and we hope you will participate in the future events in the series. Thank you again. Bye, everybody. Signing off.